Good, Mr. Chairman, I need to be out of here.
I'm whipping. Got the whip going.
Yep, that's why I want you to do it.
We didn't schedule anything in the afternoon that I missed, did we?
Not that I know of. 12 o'clock adjourn.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Stoddard is now logged on.
Excellent. Very good. Okay, Matt, it's all yours. Please take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of both committees. My name is Matt Wilmarth. I'm an LSO Senior School Finance Analyst. Today, you will receive the annual monitoring report on the cost basis of the K-12 Wyoming funding model. This is the, I believe now 11th year I will be presenting this information. Just a little background and historical information. This report used to be given to each committee individually. And a few years ago, we combined the committees in the meeting, so both committees received the same information at the same time, heard both questions from the committee members. Really just provides a little bit more efficiency from both the committee member standpoint as well as your consultants and LSO staff and Department of Education staff. I will present the initial analysis on kind of the overarching levels of funding and the changes in inflation on the cost indices that have been recommended by your consultants. Then following me will be Dr. Stoddard. She will focus her reports on the teacher labor market across Wyoming. And then finally, the Department of Education will present its information regarding how school districts allocate the resources allocated to them through the K-12 funding model. Really, Mr. Chairman, the purpose of the meeting today is for the Joint Education Committee to make its recommendation on an external cost adjustment to the Education Resource Block Grant Model, or the K-12 funding model, for the school year 2025-26, so next school year. That, by law, is required to be made by October 15th. Then the Joint Appropriations Committee will consider its own recommendation at its October meeting. And by law, they have to make their own independent recommendation to the governor and the legislature by November 1st. So that just kind of gives you a timeline of kind of the two committees' recommendations. Really, the purpose of this analysis is to ensure the components of the K-12 funding model remain at cost-based levels in years between recalibrations. And that ensures that the inflationary pressures exerted on any of these components remain cost-based. The legislature applies an external cost adjustment to ensure that occurs. The K-12 funding model is broken up into 4 separate categories. The first is professional staff. The second is non-professional staff. The third is educational materials and supplies. And the final component is energy. And there are 4 separate cost indices targeted for each of those component categories. Prior to this monitoring process, the legislature only received inflationary cost indices and the annual changes of those. They received no additional information or data. And so this process evolved over time with the legislature asking for more information about labor markets or how school districts are allocating resources and what really the prices of the funding model are as compared to the consultant's recommendations. So this has been an arduous process over the past 11 years, or really since 2011. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll have the committee turn to page 2 of the LSO report, which is meeting item number 3-01. Table 1 provides a summary of the historical external cost adjustments applied to the K-12 funding model. I will just point you to the last row of that table. The ECAs you see for professional staff, non-professional staff, educational materials, and energy were adopted or enacted by the legislature during the 2024 budget session. So for last session, the professional staff category was increased by 3.871%. The non-professional staff was a 4.106% increase. Educational materials was 21.852%, and energy was increased 14.64%. The row above that was also provided or enacted in the 2023 general session. Both of these ECAs have been sustained and are cumulative in nature. So that is the kind of explanation what the past 2 legislative sessions have yielded for purposes of an external cost adjustment. I will then draw your attention to page 4. The last paragraph there, just to give you an insight on to what has occurred for this school year, or for actually next school year. It's estimated the statutory model, your K-12 funding model, will be approximately $1.7 billion and reflects an increase in total of $16.7 million and does not assume an ECA. The estimate presumes a reimbursement increase of 6%, which is a total of $24.3 million, and a decrease of $7.6 million in other factors such as average daily membership, assuming flat enrollment, no change in health insurance rates based upon the state premiums. We have accounted for regional cost adjustment updates through the second quarter of 2024. So in total, a $16.7 million increase without an ECA, primarily coming from reimbursements.
Go ahead, Senator Rothfuss.
On the no change in health insurance, we usually project out an increase in health insurance, and I didn't think that was taken into consideration in the other side of the ECA side. I thought that was actually incorporated in the model side, and I might be wrong. So can you explain that a little further?
Please go ahead, Matt.
You bet. Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, you are correct. We have traditionally, in our long-term forecast, assumed a 6% increase on health insurance. Based upon the state's 25-26 biennial budget request, they presumed no increases for the biennium on the employee group insurance state premium rates. So we took that under consideration as part of our forecast.
Understood. Thank you.
That brings up a.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, please.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question for Matt. Could you go back on the, you talked about the regional cost adjustment and just having that funded, I thought you said funded through spring quarter of 2024. Is that what you said, or could you just elaborate a little bit? Thank you.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Grew, we will account for updates through the second quarter of 2024. I believe the final amount for fourth quarter of 2023 has been published. The second quarter of 2024, I don't believe has yet been published by Department of Administration information. I may have misspoke there. We will update that once it's published, and the next few weeks. I believe it'll come out within the next few weeks. We usually account for that in the October Craig and fiscal profile estimates.
Mr. Chairman, Matt, thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, what does the, estimate really say? Reimbursements, we used to have a 4% factor. Reimbursements over the past couple of years have actually shown a much stronger increase than the historical 4%. Part of that is the legislature has enacted ECAs greater than 4% in total. And so I think you're seeing that reflective in the reimbursement amounts. The other side of the ledger, you're seeing a decrease on just the normal updates of ADM, no increases in health insurance. Overall, you're seeing decreases in student enrollment across the state. There are some school districts that are reflecting increases, particularly in a few districts with distance education programs. But then you also see a few school districts that had a bump in distance education programs during the year preceding or after COVID, and you're seeing those ADMs decrease. And so all of that taken together, you're seeing your normal model components reflecting a overall decrease. I'll draw your attention next, members of the committee, to page 5. This is a historical analysis of your evidence-based model and your statutory model. Recall the evidence-based model is what your consultants, Pike, Assad and Associates, have recommended as its cost-based funding levels. What we do is we continue each of their recommendations for those time periods after their recalibration recommendations and apply an external cost adjustment to those amounts. We have done that for the 25-26 estimates, and that's why you see a little bit more of a widening of the cost difference at the bottom of table 2 on page 5. That increases from $29.1 million difference to $66.4 million difference. Again, we have not assumed an ECA being enacted by the legislature until it takes an affirmative stance on that. So really, what is the difference between each of these models? It is that $66.4 million estimated for next year. This current year, it's estimated at $29.1 million, which is about where last school year ended as well. So, how does that occur is you enacted an ECA for the 23-24 school year. You sustained it. Same thing with 24-25. You applied the same ECAs as were enacted on your consultants model. That's why the difference is about the same. Now, what does the $66.4 million really comprise of? It's really all contained in the personnel prices and quantities. So the number of teachers and the price of teachers, or the price of administrators and the quantity of administrators. That's really the difference that you're seeing right now. It's not really and you'll see later here in a few minutes, it's really not the prices of energy and it's really not the prices of materials. It's really all in your labor market or personnel categories. And you have diverted dramatically in a lot of different components on personnel, whether it's class sizes, number of tutors, extended day, summer school. I could go on.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, question of that table 2 on page 5, that's just ECA, that's not total funding.
Mr. Chairman, the last column is the difference between the two separate models. So our statutory model, the legislature's K-12 funding model, for this school year is estimated to allocate $1.69 billion to school districts. The evidence-based model, had that been enacted, would estimate $1,719.6 million to school districts. So that last column is just the difference between the two models. The growth of that difference is isolated to the ECA, applied to the evidence-based model, not to the legislative model.
I didn't phase that very well. The table 2 is just ECA, or is it the total funding for the school districts?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Anderson, the statutory model column, that is what is available to school districts historically and forecasted.
Chairman Scott, you have a question?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, following up on.
Mike?
Mr. Chairman, following up on that, the ECAs we're working on are only on really the labor, or mostly on the labor portions. There are major parts of the expenditures that are reimbursable, therefore automatically adjust. And as I understand, they're principally health insurance, special ed costs, and transportation costs. How are those three things handled in this table 2 on page 5 that Senator Anderson was referring to?
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Scott, you are correct. There are several categories that do not have a external cost adjustment applied to them. Those are your reimbursements. Those include special education, pupil transportation, any out-of-state or in-state tuition, any teacher extra compensation. Health insurance is also not adjusted by the external cost adjustment. That, again, is based upon the state's premium rates. And also technology costs within the model are not adjusted by the ECA, and that's at the recommendation of your consultant. So what you see in that table 2, everything through estimated school year 24-25 reflect actual historical reimbursements and costs allocated through the funding model. And then in that estimated 25-26, again, it presumes no increase to health insurance rates. It presumes a 6% increase in transportation and special education and other reimbursements. And it also presumes a flat enrollment, no increase in student enrollment.
Please continue, Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. On page 6, I'll just draw your attention to table 3. Really, this is the meat of the recommendations that the committees may or may not make. So what is the estimated cost of the ECA to the statutory model for next year? That is the last row of table 3. In total, it's approximately $36.9 million. If you utilize the ECAs or the cost indices as recommended by your consultants, that is the cost. Majority of that cost is in professional staff, $32 million. Non-professional staff, $6.9 million. Educational materials, $1.7 million. And energy is actually a decrease. It's a negative ECA this year of a decrease of $3.7 million. So all in, $36.9 million. In the past, I've received questions on, well, what if we apply an ECA to just zero that difference? So I ran some numbers based on historical questions. If you wanted to provide a ECA to eliminate that $66.4 million difference, you would apply an 8.5% ECA to the professional and non-professional staff, and then utilize the recommended ECAs on energy, negative 6.285%, and educational materials, 1.068%. So really, if you, and I just wagged the 8.5%, that gets you to an estimated $66.3 million. So I know that's been a request in the past, so I went ahead and ran that number for you ahead of time. So Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I'll move quickly here through table 4. Again, this just illustrates the estimated differences between your non-personnel categories. This school year, estimated school year 24-25, in total, the difference all in between each of the categories is $330,000. So you're about there. You know, there are various differences between student activities and, short cycle assessments and so forth. But all in, the difference is $300,000. You're about there. If you apply the ECAs as recommended by Dr. Taylor on energy and supplies and materials, if you do nothing, the legislature, the statutory model would actually fund 2.37 million more. And that's primarily because there's a negative ECA to energy of $3.7 million decrease. Any questions on that? And just to give you, again, a summary of what that ECA on the non-personnel side for education materials, Dr. Taylor's estimated cost index for that is 1.068% on all those prices except for technology and equipment and assessment costs. On energy, again, it's a negative 6.285% on the energy costs. Really what we're seeing in these are national price indices. Inflation on both of those categories is either very low, or in the energy case, it's decreased. It's gone negative as compared to the prior year. The next table I'll draw your attention to is on page 8, table 5. These are the price differences between the funding models for each of the model personnel components. Again, for the estimated 24-25, you can see the differences in that fourth column from the left, and then in the last column on the right, the estimated 25-26 school year differences. The statutory model, or the evidence-based model salaries have been adjusted for school year 25-26. The professional staff, 4.761%, and the non-professional staff, 5.41%, have been applied. And you can see the differences in most of the categories have increased because the statutory model, again, presumes a no ECA under this analysis.
Chairman?
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Matt, is there any way that you might be able to throw, and I know I could go pull it off of the crew report per district, but I don't remember if I can pull it all the way across statewide as easily as maybe you can, for the difference in position numbers for each one of these. So it's easy for us to look at the model numbers and the differences there, but the differences associated with how many total across the state we've allocated versus how many are being paid for each of those positions, not necessarily by district, but statewide.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Brown, I believe the Department of Education's report will get to a majority of that analysis later on this morning. The operations and maintenance area has been historically challenging due to a lot of school districts contracting for those services. But a majority of that analysis is contained in the Department of Education's report later this morning. Mr. Chairman and members of the committees, the final two tables I will draw your attention to are tables 7 on page 9 and table 8 on page 10. These are just the historical changes in each of the cost indices. Really, all you need to do is just look at the last row of each of those tables. That's where I'm getting the changes in the annual change of each of the 4 categories. Education materials is based upon the producer price index for office supplies and accessories. Again, that only changed 1.068%. Again, a much slower change in the past 2 years, as you can see in that table. And then energy, again, is actually a negative 6.285 based upon 3 producer price indices related to electrical power, natural gas, and light fuel oils. On page 10, Dr. Taylor computes the Wyoming comparable wage indices for professional staff and non-professional staff. And These have actually creeped up over last year, 4.761%. And I think Dr. Stoddard can speak to what not only Wyoming is seeing is the region and surrounding states. And then the non-professional staff, 5.41%. Again, that's a little bit higher than last year. So inflationary pressures on those two categories are a little bit stronger than they were when you met last year. With that, Mr. Chairman, happy to address any further questions from any members of the committees.
Go ahead, Chairman Scott.
Mr. Chairman, my memory is, I'm comparing what happened last year to that. My memory is that this committee recommended a higher ECA than did the joint appropriations, and then was finally enacted. And my question is that correct? Because I think I may have been confused by the difference between the part of the model that the ECA applies to and the full model, and may have that wrong.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Scott, my recollection is that both committees and the legislature and the governor recommended the same ECAs throughout the process. And that was the annual changes that you see reflected in the budget bill. It wasn't higher than what the cost indices reflected. Again, I think we got requests last year to, well, what if we wanted to close that gap in total? What would that ECA be? But no, the annual changes that we saw last year were forwarded from this committee to the Joint Appropriations Committee. The Joint Appropriations Committee forwarded that to both the governor and the legislature, and the governor then put that in his budget request, and the legislature enacted that in total.
Any other questions for Matt? Anybody else? Thank you, Matt.
You're welcome, Mr. Chairman. As I said, Dr. Stoddard is here today. She will be providing information on her teacher labor market report, so I'll hand it off to her. Thank you.
Dr. Stoddard, welcome. Can't hear you.
I think you're muted.
There we go.
There
Thank
you
you,
go.
Chairman, and apologies there. I'm just going to share my screen here to go through the PowerPoint slides, which I believe are also in your binders. Give me just a second. All right. So as I think many of you on the committees are aware, I've been conducting these labor market analyses for a number of years now, and the structure of this is fairly similar. Let me just start with some context before we get into what we're seeing in terms of labor market pressures. So as Mr. Wilmarth talked about, there's this difference between model salaries and actual salaries. So in black here, I have the actual salaries, the actual average salaries of teachers across districts in Wyoming. And you can see that that runs through the 2023-24 school year. So at the end of that school year, actual salaries were about $63,000, $64,000 in between that. The dashed line here shows model weighted average salaries. So this would be for each teacher looking at their education, their years of experience, what would their salary be in the model, and then averaging those model salaries. So the dashed line, you'll see, extends 1 year further than the actual salaries to reflect the ECA that was adopted, but the staffing files that I have run through the 23-24 school year. So the model salary in 23-24 was $55,700 basically. And again, that's as compared to the $63,600 or so, in terms of the actual salaries. So over time, that gap, as you can kind of see between model and actual salaries, has grown. Last year, I reported that that gap was about 16%. So due to the ECA that was adopted last year, that gap has shrunk somewhat, but still is high relative to historical standards, where actual salaries are about 14% higher than the model average salary. So in terms of framing this discussion about cost pressures, the underlying idea that I start from is that cost pressures matter because they affect the quality of teachers. And we know that teacher quality makes an enormous difference in terms of student outcomes. So cost pressures would be forces that would require higher salaries in order to maintain the quality of the teaching pool. The way I think about the teaching pool is that individuals, both who are already teaching and college students who are trying to decide what careers to go into, or teachers in other states, are deciding whether or not to teach in Wyoming based on their skills and interests, and also based on other employment options. So higher teaching salaries can then attract individuals that have better alternative employment options, and presumably those would be higher quality teachers. Whoops. So I don't present a kind of a right level of indicators as we go throughout here, but I'm showing you what these salaries, retention rates, retirement rates, all of that look like relative to historical patterns. And when you see a bunch of different indicators moving in the same direction, that's really signaling significant cost pressures on districts. So this report is combining data from a number of different sources. So data from the National Education Association, from the US Department of Education, obviously from the Wyoming Department of Education, also from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. A lot of what I'll draw on will be based on the Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics, and the University of Wyoming also supplied some data. So I have 4 different categories of indicators that the report goes through. These are related to the labor market, to demographics, to retention, and to recruitment. You'll notice I don't have any indicators relative to teacher quality, and we'll talk about that a little bit. The best information we have is about what kinds of programs individuals are coming from, what colleges and universities, but Wyoming doesn't have any direct data on teacher quality. So just briefly here, I'll kind of list off the indicators so you kind of have a sense of where this presentation is going, and then we'll go through each in turn. So the labor market indicators, we're going to look at how attractive is teaching in Wyoming compared to other opportunities in Wyoming. So you're thinking about a college student trying to decide, what do I want to major in? Or maybe a teacher trying to decide, should I stay in this profession or do I want to get a different job? And so looking at what wages are in teaching compared to other kinds of comparable professionals. The next labor market indicator will be looking at how attractive is teaching in Wyoming compared to teaching salaries in adjacent states. We'll talk briefly about demographic indicators, both changes in student enrollment and changes in teacher retirement. Both of those can impact the number of open positions that districts need to fill. And so although they aren't labor market indicators, they are an indicator of cost pressures.
Dr. Stoddard, we have a question.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah,
Please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, and my question is a general one. As I've looked at your report and seen the report in past years, you've tended to concentrate on the salaries and the comparisons there and things like benefits, other measurable costs, and some of the demographic factors. As I talk to people and as I react to things, work is such a large component of our lives that work satisfaction is a major factor. And there's several other things that go into that. I've heard a lot of complaints on our standards removing a lot of the creative abilities for teaching, making the job much less attractive. I've heard complaints about district management not supporting teachers in conflicts with parents and students, and we're seeing more of that. how do you figure, as you look at things, how do you figure those factors that aren't quantitatively measured in your analysis? How do they enter into all this generally?
Go ahead, Dr. Stoddard.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yes, that's a terrific question. And like you, I've heard those kinds of reports, not only in Wyoming, but kind of across the nation. So I'm a labor economist, and so largely I'm gonna, speak to what the data look like in terms of wage pressure, pressures in terms of labor market outcomes. But absolutely, I think those kinds of considerations can also be important factors. So one of the ways that you might see that in the data that I'm looking at is to look at kind of retention in teaching. So you might have a lot higher turnover, more exits from teaching if teachers are really dissatisfied with the conditions of their job. So that turnover might be due to salary, but it also would be due to those kinds of factors that you're mentioning. So to the degree that you see upticks in turnover, to the degree that you see drops in the number of students who are interested in teaching, even if wages are high, those would still be indicators of cost pressure. So it's a more indirect way, the way I'm gonna, incorporate that information than, surveying teachers, for example. But these indicators that we present each year are kind of a quick, I don't want to say quick, but really rapidly available data, rather than doing extensive surveys or things like that each year. So, Mr. Chairman, should I proceed?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay. So relative to your question earlier, so I'll look at the fraction of new hires and retention rates of current teachers. One thing that I'll note is that those are going to reflect current hiring conditions for school districts. And so the actual salaries that are paid are going to affect the fraction of new hires or the retention rates of current teachers, as opposed to, say, the model salaries. I'll also talk about enrollment in teacher training programs and the pipeline of future teachers. All right, so diving into each of these now in turn, starting with the labor market and these demographic indicators that would be kind of sources of cost pressure. So the first indicator is to look at teaching wages relative to the wages of other comparable professions. And so I've looked at two different categories of comparison occupations. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics classifies occupations, and one of the categories that teachers fall into is the category of professional and technical occupations. So the first comparison I do is wages of teachers compared to these other professional and technical occupations. The second comparison that I do is to look at specific occupations that have the most similar characteristics in terms of the skills required for the job, the types of characteristics of the job. Those comparison occupations have been identified by other economists. So I didn't come up with that list, but I look at the salaries in those. So in the occupational and employment and wage statistics that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does every year, it's the most rapidly available data. But those data are, because they're a survey of establishments, not a survey of workers, you can't adjust them for age or hours of weeks of work or benefits, but they're the most current source. So I'll go through those wage comparisons and then talk a little bit about hours and weeks of work and benefits.
Dr. Stoddard, we have a question.
Yes.
Now, Dr. Stoddard, I just want to be clear, the analysis, though, that you'll be providing will be based on actual teacher salaries in the state of Wyoming and not the model teacher salaries and benefits in the state of Wyoming. Is that correct? So everything we're looking at is that $8,000 a year higher figure that is being deployed by the districts rather than the base figure that is the model number that the districts are not effectively paying. Is that accurate?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, where I'm talking about just specific salaries, I often put the model salary in there just for comparison. When we look at turnover or retention rates or the pipeline of people coming into teachers, my presumption is that individuals that are choosing whether or not to stay in teaching or whether or not to go into teaching are responding to the actual salaries paid as opposed to, the model.
Thanks.
Thank you. Please continue.
Sure. So, Mr. Chairman, just to give a little bit more detail on what those comparison occupations are, professional and technical occupations, I've just listed out all of the Bureau of Labor Statistics categories there, just so you can kind of see that they range from sort of management occupations, business-related operations, a variety that also includes healthcare practitioners and technical occupations, which will turn out to be important. In looking at the most closely comparable occupations, those have been identified to be accountants and auditors, personnel training and labor relations specialists, and registered nurses. So registered nurses and accountants and auditors are the largest of these most closely comparable occupations. And again, that's something that turns out to be important in the last couple of years. So this first chart is showing the teaching wages as reported in the Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics. Again, this is the survey of establishment. So the black line is showing what those wages look like for teachers dating back to 2006. The red dotted line is showing those more specific, narrower occupations, and the blue line is showing the average wages in the professional and technical occupations. So what you can see here is that there has been an increase in the salaries of teachers, not surprisingly, based on what we talked about just a minute ago. But you can see a much sharper increase in wages for professional and technical workers, and also a particularly sharp increase in these most comparable occupations. So both of those have risen really rapidly in the last couple of years. So one thing I'll note here is that the most, and my heading is wrong. So these are up through May of 2023. So that's the most recent data that we have in terms of these specific occupations in Wyoming. That does not reflect, this very last school year that I showed you. So I'll provide some information about what I see as wage pressures in the most recent year, but this is the most up to date that we can get by looking at specific occupations in the state of Wyoming. So one thing that has been really striking in the last several years is very rapid increases in wages in both health and in business-related occupations. So if we look at these comparable occupations, and again, as I mentioned, those occupations are really the largest competitors with teaching in terms of, the number of positions in Wyoming. Those have escalated really rapidly and have continued to increase rapidly, really since the pandemic. So since the data that we see starting in 2021. If we look at those other kind of smaller occupations, they've kept pace with teaching much more closely. So again, as I mentioned, that data runs up through May of 2023. What we can also look at from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so this is not occupation specific now, but just looking at what has happened to weekly wages in the state of Wyoming, what's happened to weekly wages in other occupations, in other states in the region. So that data, again, as I'm showing you, kind of runs up through May of 2023. We'd had very rapid increases in wages, across the United States. So Wyoming had seen a 7.8 increase in average weekly wages. The next year of data, so the most recent year, that those wage pressures are cooling off a little bit, although I'll note these are still significant increases in average weekly wages. So next year, you're likely to see not maybe quite as sharp of a rise, but still, significant increases in average weekly wages in Wyoming, as well as in other states in the region. If we look at who are the groups that are experiencing that increase, so this is at the national level. If we look at this by education, one thing that we saw post-pandemic was really rapid increases in wages, and beginning with kind of individuals who had lower levels of education, so kind of high school only individuals had very rapid wage increases, in the service industry, and other kinds of industries that tended to be less skilled. What we've seen in the most recent year of data is that wages now for individuals with a bachelor's degree or more are increasing more rapidly. So it's, like I said, it's too soon to say exactly, what's happened to weekly wages of nurses in Wyoming, in 2024. But we can definitely see, nationally that there's continued ongoing pressure on wages, particularly for the more educated workers. So I would not be surprised if we see another kind of increase next year, coming from that dimension. All right, so thinking then about how much is a teacher paid relative to a non-teacher, a similar non-teacher in Wyoming, that ratio now is at 81%. A continued
Mr. Chairman.
decline. Oh,
I believe we have a question. Dr. Stoddard, we have a question. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, that graph on page 16 has BA or higher as the first line and BA or higher as the last line. Is there something critical to that?
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Dr. Stoddard.
Mr. Chairman, I think there was an error in the report. I don't know if you can see the PowerPoint slides. I've corrected it. So the last line should read all workers, where it should say 4.5% and 3.9%. So across all workers, that's been the increase in wages in the US, and the first line is BA or higher.
Thank you, Dr. Stoddard. Please continue.
Okay, so the ratio of wages of teachers to non-teachers in Wyoming, like I said, is about 81%. I've put in here the dashed line, the black dashed line is showing what that ratio looks like if you were to take the model salaries relative to the salaries of other professional and technical workers. And you can see that that's much lower. So it's about 67%. And even though model salaries had been increased due to the ECA in the last period, due to the really rapid rise of salaries in these non-teaching professions, that ratio is very low. I've also included what the ratio is of actual salaries of teachers in the US relative to professional and technical workers. That's the red line. And what that ratio is on average in the states that surround Wyoming, and that's in the blue line. So this breaks out those surrounding states so you can see more specifically where Wyoming is. So again, that dark line on top is showing the ratio of wages for a teacher in Wyoming relative to wages of a professional and technical worker. So that ratio is still higher than in surrounding states, although as you can see that kind of closing the gap with a number of them. The model ratio now is below all states in the region, with the exception of Colorado. So as I noted,
We have a question.
Oh.
Dr. Stoddard, we have a question.
Yes.
Go ahead, Representative Obermiller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 18, just on the, is this raw salary, or does that include a certain amount of benefits? What does this graph tell us in terms of how compensation is measured?
Go ahead, Dr. Stoddard.
Yeah, Representative and Mr. Chairman, this is just wages. So I'll give you a little bit of information about benefits in teaching as compared to benefits of other workers in just a couple of slides here. But yeah, this is not total compensation. This is just looking at wages.
Very good. Please continue, Dr. Stoddard.
So, one thing that I noted earlier is that in that Bureau of Labor Statistics data, they're reporting annual wages. They're not adjusting for hours and weeks of work. So in order to do that kind of adjustment, we'd need to know, how many hours a week are teachers working, how many hours a week are non-teachers working. So to address that question, I turned to census data. That's a survey of individuals. So if you look in census data, in Wyoming, how many hours a week do teachers report working? So individuals are asked, how many hours a week they're typically working. Teachers are reporting working 44 hours a week. If we look at non-teachers who have bachelor's degrees, how many hours they're reporting working? They're reporting working 45 hours a week. So hours of work per week in the typical week are pretty similar. Where we do see differences is in terms of the number of weeks of work. So if you were to take 185 contract days, that would translate into about 37 weeks of work. If you look at what teachers in the American Community Survey are working, if they report how many hours a week am I working, unfortunately, that survey data doesn't distinguish, how many hours are, or how many weeks are you working in the summer for summer school, or weeks you're working in the summer doing something else. They just say how many weeks do you work each year? So if we look at teachers who are not saying 52 weeks, the most common report is for teachers to report working 40 weeks a year. So presumably teachers are spending some time preparing and are including those weeks of work in their reports. So how many weeks of work do non-teachers work? So if we look at the National Compensation Survey, we look at the average private industry worker, they typically have 15 to 20 days of vacation. Usually the number of vacation days is relative to experience. So that's after 5 years. So that would translate into, about 48, 49 weeks of work for the typical private industry worker. So there's something of a range here. Are teachers working 37 weeks? Are they working 40 weeks? Is a non-teacher working 48? Are they working 49? So if we take, the different combinations, we get a range that teachers in general are working somewhere between 76% to 83% of the weeks of work of a private industry worker. So when we think back to those ratios, again, what I told you is that right now in Wyoming, the ratio of salaries of teachers to non-teachers is about 81%. If we look at the model ratio, again, it was about 67%. So there was the question about benefits. So again, this is more difficult data to kind of track down. There's not a source that says, here's what benefits are in Wyoming, here's for teachers, here's what they are in other states. There is national data looking at benefit comparisons. So this is national data looking at what are benefits for teachers, what are benefits, they break out data for management, professional, and other related occupations, and what are benefits for registered nurses. So teachers and registered nurses are the two occupations that are reported distinctly. So you can see there are variation here. Teachers have fewer benefits in terms of paid leave or supplemental pay, but their insurance benefits tend to be higher. If we go through and add up all of the different benefits, we get $24 an hour in terms of benefits to teachers, which is slightly higher than for management, professional, and related occupations, but lower than for registered nurses. I'll note that this is a change. So in the past, when I've presented this information, one thing I've said is that often workers in education tend to have more generous benefits packages than in other occupations. And that has really evolved over time. And so now these benefits packages, again, particularly in the health sector, are more generous in some cases than for teachers. Although, again, there's some variation. All right, so that was the comparison. How do teachers in Wyoming compare to non-teachers? Next, we turn to looking at how teachers in Wyoming compare to teachers in other states. How attractive is Wyoming as a state for a prospective teacher? So these data come from the National Education Association. So these data run up through the 23-24 school year, although the last year of data is an estimate, so subject to some revision. You can see in black here is the salary of Wyoming teachers as reported by the NEA. You can see the blue dotted line shows the average salary in the United States for a teacher. The orange line is showing the average salary of teachers in adjacent states. I also include North Dakota because in some years the committees have felt like North Dakota might be a relevant comparison state due to a similar reliance on the energy sector. And then the dashed line again is showing what model weighted average salaries look like. So again, this is now,
Dr. Stoddard, we have
Yes.
another question, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you shed any light on why the model tracks below national and regional numbers on this graph?
Go ahead, Dr. Stoddard.
yeah. So Mr. Chairman, I believe that's a legislative decision, what model salaries are. So I include this data going back to 2010, starting with some of the recalibrations. And when the model salaries are going up, that's reflecting ECAs that have been adopted or not been adopted. I believe Mr. Wilmarth spoke to that in some years, ECAs were not adopted for a number of years. In part, my understanding is that because salaries in Wyoming were so much higher than salaries in other states. But that gap, as you can see, is closing. So you can see that where actual salaries are in Wyoming, back in 2010 was significantly above where adjacent states were, and that gap has gotten smaller over time as other states have seen increases in teacher salaries. I'll note that other states don't have the same kind of funding model as Wyoming, so I can't put in like what's the model salary for other states. Some states have minimum salaries or other kinds of things, but there's not an exact comparison to Wyoming having a much more statewide model for salaries.
Senator Rothfuss has a question. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it follows up on the good Representative Obermuller's question. And Dr. Stoddard, I think one of the concerns, and I'm happy to see now the model weighted average on this chart, it seems that our recommendations on whether there is cost pressures in the state of Wyoming and therefore an impetus to provide an ECA on professional and non-professional staff is based on the performance of the solid black line. So that's the Wyoming actual, that's what we pay, where we know that we're sacrificing a large number of teachers to artificially inflate the salary by over 10%, almost 15%, to meet market demands. And then because there aren't market pressures on the market adjusted rate, which only makes sense since it's a market responsive rate, we don't have a recommendation to provide an ECA based on the cost pressures that you provide, which leads to a flat dotted black line. So it almost seems like it's a race to the bottom type approach where number of teachers is diminished to inflate Wyoming's actual to the point where the market can respond. But then when we ask you, are there any cost pressures, you can confidently say, no, there are no cost pressures, you're paying enough. And then we don't adjust the model line. So we end up sacrificing teachers next year. Is that an accurate analysis or what am I missing? And again, we've been having this conversation, similar conversations for it seems like over a decade now. And I'm still not understanding how that's not exactly what's happening. You make a recommendation based on the actuals and then we don't adjust the model as a result of it.
Go ahead, Dr. Stoddard.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, so I never make a recommendation, to be clear. I present information for you all in terms of what the indicators look like, and then that's a decision. I'm not sure if this is the venue to speak to kind of the longer history, but I'll say briefly that when I began doing this analysis, part of what appeared to be happening in the state of Wyoming when there was a very large increase in teacher salaries was districts in Wyoming competing with each other. And so while it's true that that districts made the choice to have very high salaries and to hire fewer teachers than the legislative recommendations, which my recollection is that the number of teachers was larger. The recommendations from the legislature were larger than what the consultants had recommended. That school districts, instead of hiring all of those teachers, competed with each other and raised salaries really rapidly. So, so I think that's another element that's not captured in this analysis, is the competition among districts that might lead to these increases. But in terms of, you know, should you or should you not adopt an ECA, I'm providing that information, and I've never made a recommendation one way or the other.
Please proceed, Dr. Stoddard.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, this is Representative Larson, if I may, and I don't know, Dr. Stoddard, if this is a question you can answer and maybe goes to Matt, but I think falls in to the conversation that we've had on the last two questions. And my question is if we have an actual salary model that is higher than the legislative model, what are the components in the basket of goods that's being sacrificed to fund the actual model of salaries being funded? Dr. Stoddard alluded that perhaps we're hiring a less number of teachers, maybe increasing classroom sizes, but I'm just wondering what other components in the basket of goods might be sacrificed, and do we have any of that information that could be shared with us, maybe not right now, but at some time in this conversation this morning, Mr. Chairman?
Thank you for the question. I believe Matt's got an answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Larson. We can't speak to the individual choices of school districts and what perhaps they may or may not be sacrificing in terms of delivering their education. Perhaps during public testimony, they can provide some more information on that. But through the information that the Department of Education provides, we know, and this has been since 2006-07 school year, that school districts hire fewer teachers than your funding model allocates. And that trend has continued for the past 18 years. So we know that has been a choice. They have chosen to pay a higher salary than what the model allocates. And whether that translates into higher class sizes, I think we can say yes, districts have higher class sizes than the model allocates. But in terms of delivering the basket, I think each district attests to the Department of Education that they do meet the graduation requirements and that they deliver the basket of education.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Matt.
Please continue, Dr. Stoddard.
You bet. So this next slide is then just breaking out those average teacher salaries in neighboring states in North Dakota compared to the actual salaries and the model salaries here. So you can see, I reported to this committee last year that that last year was the first year that we'd seen other states now surpassing Wyoming in terms of what actual salaries are. So that trend has continued, so that Utah now pays significantly more than in Wyoming. And you can also see that other states are not far behind. In terms of the model salary, you can see that the model salary is below the actual salaries of other states in the region, with the exception of South Dakota. So in terms of demographic indicators, these come from both the Wyoming Department of Education student enrollment numbers and projections from the National Center of Education Statistics, and looking both at what has happened to enrollment and what is likely to occur in the future. I believe Dr. Wilmar spoke to this somewhat already, but Wyoming is projected to have negative enrollment growth in the coming years, not dramatically, but but has experienced loss in the number of students up through the latest year of enrollment, and again is projected to see modest declines, I would say, in enrollment in the coming years.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Representative Larson.
thank you. I'm just curious if we have an idea if that's just based on our birth numbers, so we just are seeing a less population, or if this is reflective of people or families electing to use a different education system, or a combination of both, maybe.
Dr. Stoddard?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure of the answer to that. I do know part of what the National Center of Education Statistics does is takes the age profile of children in Wyoming. So, if I look at children that are born now and age them forward, what would student enrollment be? And I know they make some adjustments for migration patterns. I'm not actually sure about whether they incorporate information about transitioning to homeschooling or private education. I don't know the answer to that offhand.
Thank you.
So the other source of demographic pressure would be if you have a large bubble, say, of teachers who are retiring. That's largely not what we're seeing. Rather, what we're seeing is a decline in the number of teachers that are 60 and older right now. So if we think about, future projected retirements, we're not likely to see, a large increase in the number of retirements moving forward in the future. So next, I'll turn to some of these recruitment and retention indicators. So we've talked about what salary looks like. Now this is kind of looking at the pressures on districts. Are they experiencing a lot of new hires? Are they deciding to hire a lot more teachers due to adding positions? So new hires would be a combination of kind of new positions added, teacher retirements, and exits for other reasons. So in terms of the percent of new hires in Wyoming, last year there was kind of a sharp increase that I reported. That's kind of mitigated somewhat. So the percent of teachers in this last year that were newly hired was about 10.6%. The long-term average is somewhere close to 10%, so a little bit higher than the long-term average, but not dramatically so. And then one of the things when we look at retention, we can look at both the overall retention rate, but a rate that's particularly important to track is the turnover rate of new teachers. So one thing we know from research on teacher quality is that teachers gain a lot of proficiency in their first 3 years of teaching. And so if there's a lot of churn among new teachers, that would be particularly concerning if we have, continually replacing new teachers with new teachers. There's very little information in Wyoming about, which kinds of teachers beyond their level of experience. So if, the better performing teachers are more or less likely to exit. I'll note that, we don't really want exit rates to be zero, that there are always reasons that, a new teacher may decide, oh, I'm not very good at this, and I think I'm going to leave, and that would be a good outcome. So there's not, again, a right or wrong exit rate, but increases in exit rates do speak to kind of rising pressures for districts. So what we see is that, last year there was an increase in these exit rates, and this year that there hasn't been an increase, but it has stayed at that somewhat higher level. So the top line shows that, not surprisingly, exit rates are the highest among teachers that are close to retirement. So teachers that are 60 and older, about 25% of them leave in any given year. The next line, the red line, is that exit rate for teachers with 0 to 3 years experience. So again, in the last 2 years, that exit rate is at about 15%, which is modestly higher, but still a sustained increase in turnover among new teachers relative to that long-term historical average. You can also see on the green line at the bottom that that's true of veteran teachers. So if we're looking at teachers who have at least 4 but less than 20 years experience, so trying to avoid teachers that are very close to retirement, looking at these kind of mid-career teachers, again, the last several years have seen higher rates of turnover among those kind of veteran teachers than previously. So those are, again, in my view, indicators of potential cost pressures. So if we look now at who is coming in the pipeline, what programs are teachers coming from, and what does the pipeline for future teachers look like? This is also an indicator of cost pressures. And again, as I noted, that pipeline for future teachers is likely based on what actual salaries are. And we look at that both within the state of Wyoming and then some information about other states. So first, this is looking at kind of newly minted BAs. So looking at teachers who were hired in the last 5 years. So hired between 2019 and 2024, and look at those who kind of had a fresh BA. So had a BA within, a couple of years prior to being hired. About 47% are coming from the University of Wyoming. The next largest university is Western Governors University. About 14% of kind of newly minted BAs are coming from Western Governors. And then I've listed the other institutions that supply a number of teachers to Wyoming. So you can see Black Hills State, Valley City State, Chadron State, Grand Canyon University, also all contributors. I've noted in the past that some of these institutions really have largely online teacher training programs, that there have been some concerns about some institutions about the quality of teachers coming from those. But the University of Wyoming is still the dominant supply of your new hires. One thing that is concerning in this last year is a pretty sharp drop in the number of bachelor's degrees from the University of Wyoming who are graduating in teaching. So we've seen, both in Wyoming and across the nation, kind of a decline in the number of college students who are going into teaching. That had kind of plateaued in Wyoming, I would say, in about 2019 through now, but this last year saw a pretty sharp decrease. So definitely a concern. You can see that in this chart here. This is showing the number of bachelor's degrees awarded in education. And so about 40 fewer in 2024 than in 2023. And you can also see that that represents a decline in the percent of a percent of education BAs out of all of the BAs that are awarded, so that it's now kind of the lowest level that we've seen at about 7.6%.
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. In your opinion, do you feel that the closing of the University Lab School or moving it off campus is going to further erode the number of teaching graduates we see come out of the university? Thank you.
Go ahead, Dr. Stoddard.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Brennan, I think that would be a better question for the University of Wyoming. They probably have a better sense of that. All I can do is provide these, the number of graduates. One thing that did surprise me, and I don't know if that's related to your concern, is that the number of teaching majors hasn't changed that much. But there was this big drop in the number of people who got bachelor's degrees. So to me, that signals that there could be individuals who start out thinking that they're interested in teaching. Majors haven't changed that much, but then they end up graduating with a different degree. This next graph tries to compare what's happening in Wyoming with other states. So this is looking at data that comes from the U.S. Department of Education. They look at teacher preparation programs across the nation. This data is somewhat dated. So their most recent year of data is 2021-22. But it gives us kind of a 10-year span of what's been happening. The teacher preparation programs around the country, they're kind of traditional programs like at the University of Wyoming. And then there are alternative pathways to becoming a certified teacher, which historically Wyoming hadn't had an alternative pathway. So you can see in this graph here that almost all of these states, with the exception of North Dakota and perhaps not as much in South Dakota, have experienced declines in the number of individuals who are becoming certified teachers, either through a traditional program or another kind of program. You can see that the decline in Wyoming is, when we look at kind of traditional programs, is sort of in line with what's happening. But we can also see that some states, and I'll just point to Colorado and Idaho here, that the difference between a traditional program and these kind of alternative pathways really allows them to kind of close more of that gap. So they're certifying a lot more teachers through alternative pathways. And so as Wyoming, looks forward, if there are concerns about the number of graduates coming out of the University of Wyoming, these kind of alternative pathways may provide another mechanism. Something that I pointed to last year and continues to be something that I think is worth looking at is that a teacher or a potential teacher graduates from, say, the University of Wyoming and then sits for the certification exam. And that's not required for all teachers. So elementary school teachers, it's required. I believe social studies teachers are required to sit the exam. But of the people who sit that exam, Wyoming has a pretty low pass rate compared to peer institutions. And we saw another drop in that in these data. Again, this data is a little bit dated. So the last year of data available is 2021-22. But that's certainly something to be aware of in terms of improving the pipeline of prospective teachers to increase pass rates so that the students that are graduating in education that are sitting for that exam are more successful. So all of that information, let's just summarize quickly here. Wyoming average teacher salaries, the actual salaries increased about 4% in the last year, but teaching wages have continued to fall relative to the salaries of other comparable occupations in Wyoming. So the high was 96% in 2021. Teaching wages relative to comparable occupations were about 87%. That stands at 81% now. The decline between 2021 and 2023 was especially sharp due to rapid increases in wages in health and business. I note that ratio is still higher than in other states. The ratio in surrounding states is about 71%. But we continue to see this downward trajectory. So while Wyoming average teacher salaries grew more than they had through 2023-24 school year, that increase in average teacher salaries was still slower than in most neighboring states. So an ECA had been adopted in Wyoming, but the rate of salary growth was still smaller. So actual average teaching salaries in Wyoming are currently now about 5% more than the average in neighboring states in North Dakota. That's down from a 10% just a few years ago, so in 2021-22. Model salaries, though, are 7% below the actual average salaries in at nearby states, and we're below actual salaries in all states with the exception of South Dakota. As I noted, Wyoming does not face significant demographic pressures. So most of the pressures are coming from the labor market. So student enrollment, retirements, turnover rates for older teachers all don't represent significant pressures. I noted that 10.6% of teachers in 23-24 were new hires. That's similar, slightly higher, but similar to the long run average. Exit rates were about 12%, similar to last year. But exit rates for both new teachers and for these mid-career veteran teachers were similar to last year's rates, but both of those rates this year and last year were higher than in the previous 8 years. I also noted that the number and fraction of bachelor's degrees in education at the University of Wyoming has been trending downward and dropped significantly in the last year. And noted that potential recruitment challenges also are, further developing an alternative pathway into teaching, and there are concerns about this low and declining pass rate on certification exams. So with that, I've concluded my presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, sir.
thank you. Dr. Stoddard, this is Representative Larson. On that 10% of teachers being new hires, that means that they've never taught in that profession previously, or does that account for teachers maybe going and being hired in a different district? Can you clarify that a little for me, please?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative. So that represents new to that district in that year. So this would be either, so it's not necessarily new to the state of Wyoming, but that represents the number of positions that districts are filling. So districts are filling about, 10.5% of their positions in the 23-24 school year.
Do we have a feel of that number? What percent of those are new to the profession, and those that are just making some sort of movement in the profession?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but that's absolutely a number that I could get for the committees.
Mr. Chairman, if we could just maybe when you get that, send it out to us, please. Just curious.
To both committees, please. Further questions for Dr. Stoddard?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Anderson, please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'm back on the chart on page 20 of the benefits comparisons. I'm looking back on page 14. It says healthcare workers are about $85,000 a year. If I annualize this 2513, I get about $52,270 in benefits, which would be 61% of the 85,000. That seems higher than I'm used to. We used to use 30% on that. Is that current now, about 60% benefits?
Mr. Chairman, I'll note that this also includes, legally required benefits. And so those would be contributions to Medicaid and, Social Security. I'm not sure if that's the difference between the rate, but these are what are reported by employers when they're reporting what employee compensation is. And these are national numbers. So this is not what registered, the number that you gave before about the salaries of nurses was the salary in Wyoming. So I don't know what that ratio would be if we looked at the average salary of nurses across the nation, but I anticipate that would explain some of the gap as well.
Thank you.
Representative Lawley, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Dr. Stoddard. I was wondering, you talked about the University of Wyoming's drop off in sort of the traditional pathway of a bachelor's degree for teachers, but their increase in programs that were non-traditional or alternative, I think you even called them. But have you done any correlation between that? So we know there's the drop. It's easy to say this many graduates dropped off. I think you have the number 40. But what about the other? How does that compare? What numbers do you have specifically on the alternate pathways that produced trained teachers during that year?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, I don't have those numbers. So I think those would be best, questions from those organizations, but that's certainly a number that I could request and report to the committees. If that would be helpful.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Larson, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stoddard, on page 38 on the certification exam pass rate, I'm making the assumption that these exams are similar.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. This is largely the praxis exam that teachers sit for, so it's the same. That would be the same exam nationally.
And did we not kind of make note of this maybe last year or the year before in this meeting, noting that the certification pass rate was significant, or failure to pass was significant at the university, and we've had this conversation before, I guess is what I'm saying or asking.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, that's correct. So this is updated for one more year. These data, the U.S. Department of Education began collecting them and making them publicly available just in the last few years. So when they began doing that, I began reporting it. I'll note that this most recent year of data, which again, is somewhat dated, but showed a drop where, the most similar state was North Dakota, which has continued to see increases in their pass rates. So that's something to be aware of.
Thank you, Dr. Stoddard. Mr. Chairman, I thought last year when we talked about this, there was going to be some effort by your committee to inquire as to possible reasons for this gap. Have you guys learned anything on why we're seeing this?
No, we all remember the conversation, but we don't have any data.
Start that over to you.
Thank you.
It's all right.
Mr.
to
Chairman.
follow up on that, this is Chairman Nicholas. I'm curious, I mean, this is data that the University of Wyoming would have, I presume. And so even though has LSO or has the education committee requested this information directly from providers, schools in Wyoming, instead of using the U.S. Department of Education to supplement the information and actually to corroborate it. And also corroborate the issue of if it's the same test, or we're talking about what are the nuances of the test that may make it different.
I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that PTSB is the examining people on that, and we would have to ask them for the information.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator Anderson.
Mr. Chairman, on this certification exam pass rate, is that the first time they took the test, or is that all in? Because a lot of these teachers take that test 2 or 3 times, and that rate might be a lot higher if we actually looked at how many actually passed.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I believe this is just the pass rate. So literally how many individuals sat for the exam. And I should clarify that they could be graduates from another state and are choosing to sit for the certification exam in Wyoming. These are individuals that are trying to be certified in Wyoming, sat for that exam, and the percentage of them that passed. So it's very possible that some of them may pass, on a second or third time. I will note that that then it looks like they're needing to take it a lot more times in Wyoming than in some of these other states where the pass rates are closer to, 90, 95%.
That's not going to prove to be true.
Okay, further questions on Dr. Stoddard's presentation?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clausen has his hand up online.
All right, great. Go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Stoddard, again. Kind of something I brought up previously. you have benefits for Wyoming. We have the salaries, actual salaries for Wyoming, and neighboring states. But can you put together for us the total package with Wyoming and our neighboring states? So I'm looking for actual salaries and benefits compared to our neighboring states that you've brought forth.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Closton, there is not data that's comprehensive. Some states do report their benefits publicly, but other states do not. So Wyoming has, like I said, a kind of a more centralized system for that. So I could certainly report it for the few states that have it, but there's not something comparable that tracks it across all states.
Further questions?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, please.
if I can just go back to the certification exam pass rate, just real quick. So it's also my understanding, and I just want to make sure I'm understanding this comprehensively. We're only looking at the hiring. If you go back to the slide where we're hiring from, when they're trying to get hired into Wyoming, they have to take our praxis exam. So they take that praxis exam here. We have 40 some odd percent that are coming from the university. That means 60% of the university is going somewhere else or not going into the teaching profession. So that's not, I see you shaking your head. Help me understand that if you could, please.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, just to clarify, so that 47% is of all new teachers so newly hired teachers in Wyoming, how many of them are coming from the University of Wyoming?
Okay.
So there are, like about 140 students graduating from the University of Wyoming this last year. There were like 900 newly hired positions. Not all of those were, freshly minted. Some of them were teachers with experience. So I don't have a number for the percentage of University of Wyoming graduates that go on to work in Wyoming. That would certainly be something the University of Wyoming might be tracking. So I couldn't tell you that off the top of my head.
So let me rephrase my question then, just to make sure that now that I understand that the 60 some odd percent of graduates that are coming into the state are at that rate of below 75% passing exam rates. That is not a direct reflection on the university itself necessarily, because we're talking about all teachers coming in here to teach in their first year in the praxis exam, not just the university. Is that right?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown. Yes, that's correct. So we don't know on the practice exam what their undergraduate institution was, or at least not in the data that I have. So it could be the University of Wyoming, or it could be from other states. That is potentially a concern, though, about the kind of the quality of individuals that are being drawn into Wyoming. So I think this is something that's worth noting and reporting.
That's exactly what I was looking for. Thank you.
Go ahead, Representative Obermuller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm still working on definitions. So after being instructed on what model means, I'm looking on page 3, and we're comparing actual to model weighted average. So what does model weighted average mean? How is that actually calculated? What's weighted more than, what's the highest weighted component of this, or why is that used rather than a model applied to actual positions?
Go ahead, Dr. Stoddard.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is my understanding, and Mr. Wilmarth could maybe add more nuance to this. But my understanding is that the way the model weighted average is calculated is by taking each individual teacher in the state of Wyoming who's, currently working, and saying how many years of experience do they have? What's their, do they have a master's degree or not? What would be the salary for those individuals? And then adding that all up and averaging. But maybe Mr. Wilmarth has clarification on that word weighted.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Obermuller, each school district in the model has its own unique model average salary based upon the characteristics of its staff, as well as the regional cost adjustment. And so it's weighted on the number of teachers generated for each of that district, and then multiplied by the number of those teachers generated through the model. And then that's then divided by the total number of FTEs to get a statewide weighted model average salary. We just don't have a single model average salary because there are 48 unique salaries based upon their own characteristics. Does that help clarify?
Go ahead,
Just
follow
one
up.
follow-up, Matt. What is, so the component that's weighted most heavily is what?
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Obermueller, we multiply the salary for each school district for each of their teachers by the number total of teachers, and then divide that total by the total FTEs to get a weighted average salary. So it's weighted by each district's unique average salary
So.
and the number of
Mr.
teachers generated.
Just to follow up on that question, then, I guess what I don't really understand, Matt, is what's the value of this number? Because if they're all unique, I don't understand how we can use this as a tool. And in fact, the model itself, just the model numbers, obviously for compensation, the number of teachers is divergent. And so it's the statutory model, but it's not the real numbers. And so I'm just trying to, what's the aha moment at the end of the day where it's on if we're doing bad or good or well, or I'm just curious.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Nicholas, the point is you could have a graphic with 48 different lines or one line, and the purpose is to ensure that you have a comparable salary, just as a statewide average salary. Each district pays their own actual salaries. So we're trying to ensure some comparability amongst an average statewide salary and an average model salary. Teton County's salary is so high that you don't want to use just that one salary level. So the purpose is to have a comparable model salary to actual salaries, because either you're going to have 96 different lines to show each unique district's salary compared to their model salary.
So I think it would be pretty valuable to actually see one with 48 lines, just to kind of know where they are and how they lie in the spectrum of things from district to district and even school to school.
So, Mr. Chairman,
presume you have that information.
Yeah, the Department of Education's online version of their report contains that information. It compares their actual salary to their model salary. For purposes of presentation and simplicity, we look at it as statewide level. So that information is available online through the Department of Education's data system.
Matt, could
And
you
the other
send
thing
that page to us? Go ahead, Senator Nicholas, or I'm sorry, Representative Nicholas.
This is just for Dr. Stoddard. On the graphs, it seems to me that anything where we have numerical numbers, the number of teachers, you talked about 900 versus 100 or 200 on hiring, having those actual numbers of new hires each year and whether, and if we can find, and if the state knows, when you have new hires, how many are actually new teachers versus just teachers that move from district to district, all of that information. I guess my question is, that information also on the state education website?
Go ahead, Dr. Stoddard.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if that data is on the website. Certainly that's a table I could add to the report, the number of new teachers and how many of them had experience versus how many of them are freshly minted. So I certainly could provide that information for the committees.
And then going to, just to follow up, Mr. Chairman, on page 22, you have this is the average salaries across the United States, where the blue line is now roughly, it looks around 71.7 thousand is the average wage for teachers across the United States. And what I'm curious about is if you eliminate the East Coast and California, Oregon, and Seattle, what does that look like, that top line?
Mr. Chairman, so I think, so certainly rather than just kind of like, I could certainly provide that to you. I would say it's probably not going to look that different from the adjacent states in North Dakota, with some exceptions. But so the orange line there gives you the states in our region, which are the ones that Wyoming tends to draw from the most, in terms of, other students who are trained in other states who are coming and working for Wyoming. So that gives you some sense, but certainly the average could be computed, leaving out whatever states you want. I'm a little hesitant to do that because, I wouldn't want to necessarily cherry pick, which are my favorite states to leave out or not, but I certainly could provide that.
Well, you could correlate it with a cost of living index from various states, and that would kind of achieve the same thing. I would think that obviously we know that in a lot of states, the ones I just referred to, it's significantly higher. And so it would be useful to have a correlation of the cost of living indexes when we examine this particular chart.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's one reason why so cost of living is often reflected in the salaries of other workers. So if we think about, California nurses, for example, make a lot more than Wyoming nurses, and part of that is related to cost of living. And so one of the reasons that I think it's useful to look at the ratio of teacher salaries to non-teacher salaries and ask, how does that look in Wyoming? How attractive is teaching compared to other workers in Wyoming whose wages are related to the cost of living? And how does that look in other states? And so that would be the chart that's on page 17. And so when people do those cost of living adjustments, Wyoming still looks quite strong. So in terms of Wyoming's cost of living, which is reflected through the wages of other workers, Wyoming teachers are still relatively highly paid compared to other workers, though that has declined. Where when you look at both adjacent states and the United States as a whole, you can see that those are more similar. So the actual wages of teachers in the US as a whole and the wages of teachers in adjacent states, those were pretty far apart. But if you adjust them by looking at, well, how much do they make compared to other workers in their same state? Those are similar. And this is one reason why I think there's always some discussion about our teachers, the salary of teachers in Wyoming, because that model ratio is significantly lower, but the actual ratio is higher.
Thank you. So we still have to hear from Trent Carroll and Leslie Zimmerfeld. Thank you. I won't even try it. But we're going to take a break. We're going to take a 10-minute break and come back. I have 10:51, so be prepared to be back and going at 11. All right, we'll call this meeting back to order again. And with that, we have Trent Carroll, Chief Operations Officer from Wyoming Department of Education, and Leslie Zimmerscheid.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay? Could I get a thumbs up?
You're good.
Excellent, thank you. I am Trent Carroll with the Wyoming Department of Education, and I'm joined today by Leslie Zimmerscheid. We are here to provide the annual continued review of educational resources in Wyoming report, which we affectionately refer to as the CREW report. The CREW report provides a comparative analysis of funding model resources and actual district staffing and expenditure data. I think everyone on this call is familiar with the CREW, so I won't belabor the introduction here. We will try to be brief today. I know we're running a few minutes behind, but please jump in at any time if you have questions. At this time, I will hand it over to Leslie and we can begin the presentation.
Great, thank you. I hope everyone can see my screen all right.
Yep.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Mr. Carroll gave you some great background, and so I just want to begin by saying this is an analysis of model-funded components to actual expenditures, and it's just one part of the overall monitoring report. So we're going to be talking about model to actual in these slides. There will be a complete version of this report published on our website. We were working on it this morning, so hopefully by the end of the day, we can send out a link to the full report to everyone. That report will have data through fiscal year 23. Fiscal year 24 is still preliminary. I will discuss some preliminary numbers in my slides, but when we send out the link to everyone, that will be through fiscal year 23. So, Mr. Chairman, members, the first component I'd like to talk about is ADM. The funding model uses either the greater of the district prior year actual ADM or the 3-year average at the district level. ADM has declined for the 4th year in a row. The 3-year average, you can see, has smoothed the drop from COVID, from the COVID years, but ADM does continue to decline. So the model ADM number is in blue, the prior year actual is in orange, and a straight 3-year average is in the gray. Moving along, the next slide is about the at-risk count. The funding model allocates additional resources to school districts for at-risk students. An at-risk proxy is determined by the unduplicated count of students designated as English learners, including their first 2 years of monitoring, free and reduced lunch students, and mobile in the secondary grades. And now mobile means a student who moves either between districts or between schools in the same district in between the October enrollment snapshot and the March enrollment snapshot. So the at-risk proxy funds additional resources for certified tutors, pupil support positions, and summer school and extended day programs. You can see Wyoming's at-risk count has increased over the last few years, and it's mostly due to the increase in free and reduced lunch program participation. There's no questions on that. We'll move on to our salary and staffing analysis. The purpose of this section is to provide you, the committee, with actual salary and staffing patterns compared to the model. As you recall, ADM generates resources into full-time equivalent positions, or FTEs, and then those FTEs are then multiplied by each staffing category's district compensation amount. And we'll start with the categories that fall under the ECA for professional salaries. So here on page 7, we'll start with teachers. The chart on the left are FTE model to actual comparisons for the last 5 years. 23-24 model funded FTE was around 6,755, while the districts hired about 5,825 teachers. So that means the districts employed about 930 fewer teachers than the model provided last year. In the chart, the model will be in blue and the actuals will always be in orange. If you look at the line graph, the average teacher salary in 23-24 was 63,853, while the model weighted average salary was 55,786, meaning the districts paid about $8,000 more than the model. And below that, there's a table, and the charts on there have the model FTE to the actual FTE with the difference. And then on the right-hand side, we have the model average salary with the average regular salary, the difference, and the percent difference. So in 23-24, teacher average regular salaries were 114% of the model, or 14% above the model. The next slide is about tutors. Tutors, the model generated about 363.5 tutors, and the districts hired 102.53 tutors. So the districts employed 260 fewer tutors than the model provided. The average tutor salary was $68,054, while the model provided $55,786, meaning the districts paid about $12,200 more than the model. And in this category, the salary, that's about 118% of the model. My next slide is about instructional facilitators. In 23-24, the model funded 132.48, while the districts hired 79.13 instructional facilitators. That means the districts employed 53.2 fewer instructional facilitators than the model provided. The average salary was $71,973, and the funding model weighted average salary was $55,786, meaning the districts paid about $16,100 more than the model. And that is about 21.5% over the model. My next slide is about the librarians. The model funded FTE was 274, and the districts hired just over 80 FTE, which means the districts employed about 193 fewer librarians than the model provided. The average librarian salary in 23-24 was $67,652, and the model provided $55,786, which means the districts paid about $11,800 more than the model. And that is about 117.5%. You'll probably notice these four previous slides, the model weighted average salary was the same for each of them, and that's because these four categories are all funded as teachers. Moving on, assistant principals. In this category, the model funded about 153 FTE in 23-24, and the districts hired about 95 assistant principals, which means the districts employed about 57 fewer assistant principals than the model provided. The average salary was $99,648, while the model average salary for assistant principals was $78,960. Which means the districts paid about $20,600 more than the model. Next, we have principals. The model funded about 266 principal FTE, and the districts hired 273.5, which means the districts employed about 7 more principals than the model provided. The average salary in 23-24 was $105,676, while the funding model was $90,980, which means on average, districts paid about $14,700 more than the model.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative Larson.
Thank you. I'm just curious how you have on this, the number of principals. Are we then saying that some schools have more than one principal? Is that how you have more principals than the model is funded for?
Go ahead, Leslie, can you answer it?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. The districts hired more principals than the model provided.
Matt has a follow-up. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Larson, just to give a little bit more context here, any alternative school or school with 49 or fewer ADM are resourced differently than a school greater than 49 ADM or not an alternative school. Those schools are resourced an assistant principal position and one teacher for every 7 ADM. A principal position is not resourced for a small school or an alternative school. So that's the reason why you see a larger number of principals hired. The school districts are, in most cases, likely hiring a principal position for a alternative school and perhaps maybe in some of the smaller schools. So that's just a little bit more context there.
Thank you. That helps.
Please go ahead, Leslie.
Okay, our next slide is about business managers. The model funded
Mr.
48.
Chairman, Representative Clausen also has a question.
Go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Ms. Zimmerscheid or Mr. Carroll or someone else. Can you give me a little historical perspective on the model? How long has models been in place, and a little bit what it was based on, since we're just seeing such a difference between the model and the actuals?
Mr. Chairman, we've used the model for more than 15 years. And I think I would like to defer to Mr. Wilmarth for anything more detailed than that.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Clauston, the grid or the backbone of the model has been in existence since school year 2006-07. There have been some tweaks through some recalibration efforts or non-recalibration years. But in general, since 2006-07, it's been in place. The discrepancy or the differences you see in salaries or FTEs are not new. They've been that way for a long time, and there's various reasons for that. But since 2006-07, this model and allocation system has really been in place since then.
Does that help, Representative?
Mr. Chairman, I'll continue with business managers. The model funded 48 business managers and the districts hired 44.8 in 23-24, which means the districts employed about 3.2 fewer business managers than the model provided. The average salary was $107,183, while the funding model provided $80,091, meaning the districts paid about $27,000 more than the model, which is about 133.8% of the model. My next slide, number 14, page 14, assistant superintendents. The model funded 48 of those, and the districts hired 18.8, which means the districts employed fewer assistant superintendents than the model provided. The average salary was about $143,500, but the model provided about $110,500, meaning the districts paid about $33,000 more than the model, which is about 130% of the model. The next category that I'd like to discuss is central office administrators. The other types of central office administrators that were funded in 23-24, the FTE was about 135, and the districts hired about 207 FTE, which means the districts employed about 72, 73 more than the model provided. The average salary was 103,849, and the model provided about 116,000, which means the districts paid less than the model, about 12,450 less than the model. And this is the only category where the average regular salary is less than the model. My next slide is superintendents. The model funded 48 superintendents and the districts hired 46.66, which means there were about 1.3 or 4 fewer superintendents than the model provided last year. The average salary was 151,655, and the funding model provided 117,996, or about 118,000, meaning districts paid about 34,000 more than the model.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Brown, please go ahead.
If I can just ask Matt on this particular one, I understand the small school differentiation with principals and assistant principals. We've talked about that numerous times. I'm really confused how we can have 1.34 different, and I'm supposing that's just how the allocation of that particular school district chose to not fund it a full superintendent. But I'm just trying to figure out whether it's Matt or Leslie, I don't care which one, how we actually have 1.34 less full-time equivalents than having a full-time. It should be a whole person, would be my assumption. I'm just trying to figure that one out.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Brown, I'll defer to Leslie if my explanation is incorrect, but there may be some instances in a smaller school district where a portion of the superintendent's salary is reimbursed as the special education director or the transportation director. I know in some instances that can be the case, but I'll defer to Leslie.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. There also sometimes in periods of turnover, the position may be vacant for a little while, which would cause that. Okay, that was the last slide, Mr. Chairman, that is associated with the professional salaries, ECA. So just to recap a little bit, teachers, tutors, instructional facilitators, librarians, assistant principals, business managers, assistant soups and soups all had actual FTE fewer than the model resourced. Principals and other central office had FTE greater than the model provided. The other central office admin category was the only one with an average regular salary lower than the model average. So the range of that would be from about 88% of the model to 133, 134% of the model. And now I'm going to move on to the staffing categories that are associated with the non-professional salary ECA. So on page 17, operations and maintenance. In 23-24, the model funded about 1,542 FTE, and the districts hired about 1,210, which means the districts employed about 332 fewer than the model provided. The average operations and maintenance salary was about 42,500, while the funding model provided 35,800 or so, meaning the districts paid about 6,600 more than the model. So that's about 118%. My next slide is about paraeducators. Statute and attachment A use the term supervisory aides, but paraeducator is more appropriate, so that's what I've put in my slides here. It's a more commonly used term. In 23-24, the model funded about 633 FTE, while the districts hired about 703 paras, which means the districts employed about 70 more than the model provided. So in this category, we have both instructional and non-instructional paraeducators. And a non-instructional para would be something like an interpreter or a bilingual aide. The average para salary in 23-24 was about $27,500, while the model provided about $20,800, meaning districts paid about $6,700 more than the model. So I'm going to move on now to secretary and clerical, and I just want to let you know there's a few typos on this slide. If you look at the bar graph, the numbers in the bar graph are correct, but the table down below has the typos in it. So please look at the numbers in the bar graph. In 23-24, the model funded an FTE of about 1,017, and the districts hired about 854.1 secretary and clerical, which means the districts employed about 163 fewer than the model provided. The average salary for a secretary or clerical position in 23-24 was just over $41,000, while the funding model provided about $33,580, which means districts paid about $7,800 more than the model. So that's the end of the categories, staffing categories that are associated with the non-professional ECA. To recap, O&M had an actual FTE that's fewer than the model. Paraprofessionals and secretary and clerical had an actual FTE greater than the model. And all three categories paid actual salaries greater than the model. And it ranged between 118 and 133% of the model.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Leslie, if you can just kind of help me here. When you have secretary and clerical, this was something that I had asked Matt earlier in his report, and he breaks it out with school secretary, school clerical, and then central office clerical. Am I to assume that what you've got here is a mixture of all three of those combined? And if so, is there any way that you can break those down to where those are identical to what we see here from Matt with our monitoring report on the school level versus central office level?
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Brown, yes, this slide here in the presentation has all those positions combined. So it does have school level and central office combined. The crew report disaggregates it, and I can create some additional slides to send over to you that look like this, that have them broken out by school versus central office.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
So I'd like to finish, Mr. Chairman, the staffing analysis with just an overall summary of the FTE. And this is not in your slides, but I could provide it if you want. Teachers are about 61% of the hires in districts. And in descending order, that's the biggest slice of the pie. And then descending order from there, operations and maintenance is about 12.7%. Secretary and clerical, all secretary and clerical combined, it's about 9%. Paras are about 7%. Principals are 3%. Central office, those other central office categories, are about 2.2%. Tutors and assistant principals make up about 1% of the staffing. Librarians are about 0.8%, Instructional facilitators are also about 0.8%. Superintendents and business managers each are 0.5%. And assistant superintendents are 0.2% of the actual FTE hired every year.
So, Mr. Chairman, do we have a chart for that? I don't find it in this materials that have those numbers and the actual numbers as well.
Mr. Chairman, that summary that Leslie just walked through was a late addition to our presentation. And so it didn't make it into the materials before the cutoff, but we would be happy to email that to the committee following our presentation today so that you have that comparison.
Thanks, Trent. And could we get percentages and actual numbers, please?
Mr. Chairman, will do. Thank you.
Any other questions before we continue? All right.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd like to move on to class sizes now.
We have one question. Go ahead, Representative Obermuller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Reluctantly, I'll weigh into the same question I had earlier. The term model within this modeling, for example, model FTE, where does that modeling come from? Is that statutory or some other modeling?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Obermuller, that is the level set by the legislature through its non-codified law and adjusted by the external cost adjustment. So through the recalibration processes, you have established prices for each of the model components. And then those are further adjusted beyond a recalibration by an external cost adjustment. So you don't go into your green books or session law every year and update the number. You leave that to the inflationary factor that you apply to that. It's less cumbersome than opening up your books every year. But then that is then folded into your funding model and used by the Department of Education based upon whatever action the legislature takes.
Go ahead and follow up.
Matt, I couldn't quite hear you because your microphone was a little bit far away, but you said something about how recalibration itself fits into this. Could you repeat that part of it?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the prices that are, it's not everyone, but almost all of the components that are set by law are from a 2011 recalibration effort. The legislature has since that time adjusted those by an external cost adjustment. You do those in years between a recalibration. There have been some instances where other price points, and this gets back to a bill that the Joint Education Committee reviewed at its last meeting in August, where you have gone in and adjusted amounts for supplies, materials, or student activities. But generally, all that is set during a recalibration effort. And then you leave it to your application of a external cost adjustment to adjust those further up or down, depending on whatever percent that is.
Go ahead, follow up.
Yeah, thank you. So Matt, so ultimately, those FTEs represent what the legislature actually puts into statute. The recalibration is a starting point, but ultimately, it's what the legislature passes. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, the legislature does set the formula, and then those FTEs are dependent upon the characteristics of that school district or school. So the number of students generally modify those FTE amounts in most cases. So you set the parameters of whatever you're going to fund, and then that gets translated into FTEs based upon the student enrollment at each of those schools or districts.
Go ahead, Leslie or Trent.
Mr. Chairman, class sizes by school type. So this slide has historical class sizes based on the type of school. And the model resource is a 16:1 student-teacher ratio for the elementary grades. But the full crew report shows an analysis of all grades and all types of schools. So secondary, for example, secondary grades are resourced at 21:1. There was a law that was repealed in 2017 that districts were required to ask for a waiver if they did not meet an average student-to-teacher ratio of 16:1 for the K-3 grades. That has been repealed, but we still ask districts to try and maintain that ratio. And so this analysis shows that there was a dip because of the COVID years, but otherwise our class sizes have remained very steady over the last 10 years. And if there's no questions on class sizes, I want to move into our expenditure analysis.
Please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, the crew report provides a comparison of model generated non-staffing resources to district actual expenditures, which may include some contracted services. And so these numbers here for 23-24 are preliminary, and we should have those final numbers available for you in the next couple weeks. This first slide has a comparison of non-instructional expenditures model compared to the model to actual for the last 10 years. Non-instructional expenditures include things like utilities, operations and maintenance, central office, and miscellaneous district expenditures. The O&M does include some staffing just because there's always been some wiggle room between districts that want to hire their own operations and maintenance staff versus contracted staff. So. Are there any questions on this slide? Moving on, our next slide has the comparison of instructional expenditures model to actual. Instructional expenditures mean professional development, student activities, CTE, or educational supplies and materials. There used to be a component that was included up through 2017-18 for assessment, but it was removed in school year 18-19. So you can see that in the most recent year, instructional expenditures were about 1.7 million lower, which means districts spent about 98% of their resourced amount. Slide number 25. These are our transportation reimbursements for the last 10 years. The estimated reimbursement for this year is about 10 million more than last year. This does include operations and maintenance for transportation as well as vehicle purchases. There's no questions. I'm going to move on. This pie chart shows the total guarantee. These are total state funds from the model that are provided to the school districts, that were provided to the school districts for fiscal year 24. You can see the largest slice of the pie are school level resources. About $946 million is generated in the model for school level needs. The next largest slice of the pie in orange, those are the district level or central office resources, which are about 264 million. Last year, the reimbursements were about 93 million. That's the blue slice. And so you can see that our total guarantee for the 23-24 school year was just a little more than 1.3 billion.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Leslie, this is the guarantee. Do you by chance, or will you by chance, happen to have what the reported expenditures are broken down in this same pie chart? Is that something that you can do?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we can do that.
That would be great. Thank you.
Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Chairman Scott, please go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, your reimbursements on this obviously do not include special ed and transportation reimbursements because they're both larger than what you're showing. What are the reimbursements that are here?
So, Mr. Chairman and Senator Scott, this is the actual reimbursement for 23-24. I'll back up one slide. Oh, that's the wrong direction. Our transportation reimbursement last year was 91,960,000. And this chart with the transportation includes an estimate for 24-25. So when I moved to the pie chart, which was last year, 23-24, the total reimbursements where the transportation is included in this right here. Transportation is included in this. Special education is not, but it's on my next slide for you.
Mr. Chairman, just to add a little bit more context on the guarantee amount, recall the foundation program guarantee is supported by both state and local revenues. Moving the special education amount outside of the foundation program guarantee puts it all on the state's tab. Local revenues don't support that. So when we talk about a school district entitlement amount and recapture amount, that is only under the formula for that considers the foundation program guarantee. So that's just a little bit more context to that.
So, Mr. Chairman, this pie chart is actual for fiscal year 24, including transportation, but not including special ed. Slide number 27, this is the special education reimbursement, and it was removed from the model in fiscal 23. This shows a 10-year trend of the amount reimbursed. And then on the side, you'll see a count and percent of the students receiving services. The current reimbursements are about 20 million more than last year. And you can see that both the count and the percentage have increased over the last few years.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Representative Larson.
on that special education slide there, that talks the percentage of the total enrollment that have an IEP. How does that compare the 15.2% of the total population having an IEP? How does that compare with states around us?
Mr. Chairman and members, the state of Wyoming is very similar to our surrounding states and the national average. We track with the national average very, very closely.
Okay.
And this slide here has our general fund expenditures, so excluding anything federal, general fund expenditures by their major function for the last 10 years. You can see that the majority of expenditures are for instruction. Instruction would be things that deal directly with the interaction between teachers and students. So it could mean teaching, it could mean technology that supports that. It could also mean supplies. So. That's the final slide, Mr. Chairman.
Excellent. Questions for Leslie? All right. Trent, does that conclude everything?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a couple of follow-up requests here, and we'll get those sent over as soon as possible.
Yep, send it to both committees if you would, please.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right. If there's no further questions, we will move to public comment. Okay, public comment's open. Anybody like to comment? Remember to state your name, who you represent.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Almost good afternoon, still good morning. Jeremy Smith, Business Manager, Sheridan County School District Number 1. And this is my 27th year, Mr. Chairman, believe it or not. I started when I was 3. I'd like to just start going through a couple of the reports, and I'll be as brief as I can and certainly stand for any questions as we go through or at the end. I'd like to start just pointing out something, and it is certainly not intentional, I know, but just for room. But page 2 of the monitoring the cost basis of the K-12 Wyoming funding model report, table 1, where it shows the historical ECAs given since 2001, 2002. It's missing several years, right? It skips from 2001-2 to 2003-4, and then skips from 2009-10 to 2014-15, and then also again 2016-17 to 2019-20. And just for historical background knowledge for the committee, those were years in which you gave 0 ECA. In addition, Mr. Chairman, what's not noted in this table, but just again for historical context, is some of these ECAs were one-time ECAs and not cumulative. So they were given and then taken away the next year, okay? So just, again, some historical knowledge. I know there's several new folks on the committees and those that haven't been around since 1998. Next, Mr. Chairman, pages 9 and 10 on that same report. Start with table 7 on page 9. I struggle with the energy, and this is nitpicking a bit, and I apologize because it's really not a big chunk of what we receive in the funding model. But there is no shot anyone's utility bills are going down next year, right? I mean, Rocky Mountain Power is looking at price increases. So again, you're taking national data and trying to localize its purpose. Again, it's a minor component of the model dollar-wise, but just to be clear, there's no way anyone's power bill is going down next year, right? So although we kind of, accept this as a function of how the models and the indices chosen work, just to be clear, if you really want to understand or represent what's happening inside of the state of Wyoming, you would not adopt a negative ECA on utilities. You just wouldn't do it. But again, just from historical perspective, and you have in the past adopted negative adjustments to our utilities costs. You can see that in the history of it. And we don't complain a lot about that because, again, it's kind of a smaller part. But as you work your recommendation, these numbers are valid based on the indices, and we're good with that. But you really should do an 8.5%. I mean, if you really were going to get this model to what it should be based on prices that we're experiencing currently, I think Mr. Wilmarth gave you that number to erase the differential. And that doesn't address the base model assumptions on salaries. Let's be clear about that. The base model assumption on salary for a teacher is like $40,268. There's no way anyone's hiring a first-year teacher at $40,268. And then you adjust it for, RCAs, of course, because Teton, has a 166% of average or something like that. But still, there is no district. And my district receives 0 RCA. We're at the state average, the Lake Wobegon stuff. Our funding models, or our teacher salary base start is 48, and we're in the bottom quartile of salaries in the state. So you really should adopt an 8.5% on the professional and non-professional to erase the deficit. Still doesn't address the base model, but that's what you should do. I don't know what you're going to do, but I hope someone makes that recommendation. All right, Mr. Chairman, then moving on to it's in the report or in the slide presentation from Dr. Stoddard. It's page 4 And the cost pressures matter because they affect the quality of teachers. I highlighted and want to just reiterate her fourth bullet on there. High teaching salaries can attract individuals with better alternative employment options. I think that's a consistent theme throughout this. It gets a bit muddled with, flipping back and forth between the consistency of using the model salaries you guys provide in the funding model versus what we end up having to pay. And so I wish you would just stick with the model because that's what you do. What and how we respond is the actual salaries, right? But what you fund is the model salaries. And so I've wished since the beginning of time on this report that she just eliminated what we actually pay and try to compare that with what you provide, because that's the one you control. But again, her point is, and it's well taken and it's true, my daughter who's a senior this year at Tongue River High School, she's going to go to the University of Wyoming. She's looking at becoming a teacher in social studies. She could make a lot more money. She's going to be valedictorian, I think, of her class. She's tied for 3 or 4 kids are tied for valedictorian spot. She can make a lot more money doing some of these other jobs. But you should probably pay what she's worth, right? I mean, that's the point. So high teaching salaries do attract people to this profession. And then if you look, the consequence of this, of not paying the salaries, go look at the number of graduates from the University of Wyoming in teaching. It's dropped significantly. Why? Because they can make more money doing something else. That's the reality of it. And so the graduates from this year that you saw that massive drop off, remember when they chose what profession they were going to go into 4 years prior to that, maybe sometimes 5, right? It depends on how long it's going to take you to get through. But they made that choice in 2020 to not go into teaching. And we're seeing the consequences of that now. So I just want to be clear about that. And someone asked a great question, and I believe it was Senator Scott, it was you, who said, do we have some sort of data about work satisfaction? Well, yeah, we do. The WA did it last year, and you saw it was terrible. And that's still true. Teachers aren't very satisfied in their profession right now for a whole host of reasons, but one is certainly salary. They see the RN next to them making 30% more than they do, and they have the same degree level, same professional training, same kind of responsibility. And so these are consequences of choices that have been made over time by previous legislators and legislatures in general, right? Not certainly not owned by any one person, but these are conscious choices that have been made to reduce the salaries of teachers to a level that is now not going to be sustained. And so you have a problem. You're going to have to give bigger raises than you really want to. That's what's going to happen. So I think I could go through several other things in here, Mr. Chairman, but the point is, you got to give the ECA. It's got to be substantial and substantive in order to turn the ship around that's been turned the wrong direction for about 10 years. It's been since about 2016, 2017. If you look on all the little crisscrossy lines, like when did the model salary go below all of our neighboring states? It wasn't last year. That's when our actual salary did that. It was like 2016. That's when that happened. So if you look, it's on page 18, model ratio is now below most surrounding states. That happened in 2016, where we started dropping below everybody else. So this has happened over a period of years. It's going to take some time to reverse it unless you do some massive corrections, which may or may not be required in the future anyway. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to take any questions, answer anything you might have. But and I did forget one other point I was going to make. Someone asked about what are the things districts are doing relative to this position. You saw it's class size. We still are delivering all of the basket of good requirements, right? We're having to do all those things, hire people to do all the, all 9, 10 now items in there. But it's class size. Look at it. It's elementary class size. It's not secondary school class size. It's elementary school class size. And when do we want kids to be good readers? K-3, right? That's that critical part. That's a direct consequence of that. Plus facilities, that's a whole separate conversation, but that's what we're doing. Less frequent adoptions on technology and curriculum, and less enrichment activities and opportunities for kids. That's another place we sacrifice, but really in the big place, it's class size in elementary schools. So, okay, I'll shut up now, Mr. Chairman, and stand for any questions or go sit down and get ready for lunch. So.
Jeremy? Online? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody else, public comment? Anybody else, public comment? Please state your name.
Mr. Chairman, Brian Farmer, Wyoming School Boards Association. I think there's a bit of reluctance from folks here to really say anything because there's one question before the committee today, and that's whether or not an ECA is appropriate. I think the abundance of information presented to you today says yes, in fact, that's the case. An ECA is warranted. And an ECA external cost adjustment really does just one thing. It holds the model consistent. So it accounts for the cost of inflation over time. And so our question is, has there been inflation? I think we all know that, yeah, there's been inflation. Do we need to adjust for it? Yeah, we need to adjust for it. As Mr. Smith just said, really, we've kind of dropped below what we used to call the constitutional floor. We are funding at a rate less than what the consultants recommended. And so ideally, we ought to correct to that level. But at a minimum, we need to correct or adjust to a level that keeps us consistent with the rate of inflation. And so the reluctance, I think, of the folks out here is that it just seems like an obvious decision for this committee. And so just want to say that we support that decision to fully fund the ECA.
Thank you, Brian. Questions for Brian? Online? Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else? Going once? Going twice. All right, we will close public comment.
Want a motion now?
We can start with a motion and go from there. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think, you know, we have a decision as to what we want our objective to be today. A straightforward ECA, which holds us equivalent to last year, is provided in the staff memo. So that's 4.761% professional, 5.41% non-professional, education materials at 1.068, and then energy at negative 6.285%. That holds us equivalent to last year, but we know that last year we were effectively $30 million behind. Mr. Wilmarth provided the suggestion that if we wanted to take it to the point where we had a dollar value equal to the evidence-based model, that would be 8.5% professional, 8.5% non-professional, and then matching the same educational materials and energy. That makes us constitutional, at least face value constitutional in terms of achieving what the evidence-based model would say. I think that's appropriate policy for us to at least take it back to even. So my motion would be to take us to what is effectively equivalent to the evidence-based model through our statutory model. So my motion would be 8.5% professional, 8.5% non-professional, 1.068% educational materials, and then negative 6.285% energy, although I do concur that it's very unlikely that the energy prices will ever go down. Haven't seen that myself. So that is my motion.
We have a motion on the floor, seconded by Representative Provenza or Representative Brown. Discussion. Go ahead, Chairman Scott.
Mr. Chairman, first, a question for Mr. Wilmarth on tables 7 and 8 on the memo that y'all provided on page 9 and 10. The relevant school year for this external cost adjustment applies to, would it be the 24-25 school year or the 25-26? He was talking 25-26. Which one is relevant?
Mr. Chairman, this is for the 25-26 school year.
Correct. That's my motion. I'm sorry, that was unclear.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, on and against this motion, I think the 8% is out of line. I don't see the justification for that. And I don't know whether you're trying to correct some of the discrepancy between the model and the actual, but I think that's something best left to recalibrate, and that's a complicated thing.
Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
So if that was unclear, I'd direct the committee and the good code chairman to page 5 of the memo provided by Mr. Wilmarth and the bottom of table 2 to explain what. So the motion, you see that there is a $66.4 million deficit in the lower right corner from, and that's the difference between an evidence-based model valuation and a statutory model valuation with no ECA. The 8.5% takes that parenthesis in the lower right, that 66.4 becomes 0. That's the purpose of the motion. When that is 0, that means that we're constitutional. It is the amount that it takes to make a constitutional statutory model equivalent to the evidence-based model, and it's the minimum amount which Mr. Wilmarth provided. If we don't go to 8.5%, if we go to the 4.7, 5.4, 1.06, et cetera, that number is around 30 million. I think it's elsewhere in the document, but it's basically a continuation of the $30 million non-constitutional deficit that we've had for the past 3 years. And that was honestly after fixing it a bit after 22-23, where we were almost 55 million unconstitutional, but we took some action at that point in time to narrow the gap a little bit by reinstating, based on my recollection, reinstating some prior ECAs that were eliminated because they were one time. So that's the purpose of the motion, and just so that the co-chairman understands that that's the reason for the 8.5%. It's not an arbitrary number. It was the staff recommended number to take that 66.4 to 0 and make us constitutional even ahead of the recalibration.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, I'd reiterate again that I think that the dealing with the difference between the model and the actual is a matter for the recalibration, because it's a very complicated thing. You've got to recognize that some of that is that the districts get a block grant and they can reallocate that the way they want to. Second, I would say very clearly that there is no figure that is constitutional until the legislature has provided it, because that is the function of the legislature. And no court can tell us what the final figure ought to be. That's reserved to people who are elected by the people and can be replaced by the people, which is us. And so I feel very strongly that the argument that one figure is constitutional and one is not is totally irrelevant. And I think this leads to a driving of the object here is to drive the funding beyond what is required. And frankly, I'm not seeing that the funding levels that we do have are in any way affecting the quality of the results. So I'm, again, on and against this motion.
Further discussion, go ahead, Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to be very clear and very careful. staff did not give us a recommendation. Staff has provided us the information provided to us by consultants. And so I just want to make that very, very clear. I don't like putting staff in the firing lines. That tends to get some feathers ruffled there. That being said, I will be in support of this, and a lot of this does have to do with the fact of the inaction over our part over the course of the past 8 years that I've been in the legislature for one-time ECAs, non-sustained. When we don't sustain ECAs, this is what happens. It comes back and bites us. And that's exactly what we continue to have happen to us, is when we don't take care of the model discrepancy from the ECAs in previous years, those compound. And we all know what compounding interest does. It makes the things get a little bit bigger, a little bit faster. And that's exactly what has happened here. I will be in support of this. I will say, although we're not going to be going after the energy portion on this, we gave a substantial energy portion last year. I can't say that all of that got spent towards energy, right? It is a block grant model. I did some math, and some of the stuff that I was looking at here, just to kind of give the committee some understanding of where we're at, looked at all the model figures and everything like that. And the big one that I want to point out to the entire committee is we continuously hear that education is top heavy and we have a lot more administrators than we should be paying for. If you look at the crew report, it actually says the exact opposite. It actually says we're about where we should be. And then when you actually look at the teachers, that's where we're short right now. And a lot of that has to do with we're not paying the teachers what they can be making elsewhere. We're not attracting that. So just kind of give the committee an understanding what that looks like. We're short on teachers we're shorting the model $59.4 million right now, or that's the difference, I'm sorry, of what we're allocating and we're not spending on teachers. But if you take that and you say, okay, well, we're also paying teachers more, that equates to $54.5 million. So there's a delta there of about $4.9 million. Well, that only equates to 77 more teachers. 77 more teachers is barely 1.7 teachers per school district extra. We're not funding our school districts with the valuable resources they need to teach these kids. The crew report doesn't lie. These are just statistics that flat out tell us how they're spending this. And that's why I want the information from the Department of Ed that we're, what's the class getting and what's the administration getting, because those are pretty telling numbers. But when we have a shortfall of $66 million projected, this is not just frivolous spending. A lot of this is going to make sure that these teachers are getting paid what they want. And I'm going to go on a personal tangent here, and I'm just going to say my brother was one of the graduates that came out of the University of Wyoming last year. The offer that he received from Arizona was $22,000 more a year than what he was offered for any school district here in the state of Wyoming, including Cheyenne, where his home was. He picked up and moved to the state of Arizona, where he's going to pay income tax because he can make $22,000 more a year. So this is not something that I think needs to be political in nature. This is something that we need to understand, that we are shorting our teachers. And again, the statistics don't lie. When we're sitting there saying that the administration is top heavy, the only area that I see is other administrative staff. And I would like to know what that boils down to, and I'll be reaching out to the DOE on that. But I will be supporting this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Obermiller, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also will be supporting this motion. I want to gently push back on the idea that only the legislature counts and recalibration doesn't count. Recalibration was brought about for a purpose, which was to depoliticize that process, to get outside consultants weighing in on what it should cost us for our education. So I think that part of it should be the North Star. I think the senator is right that should be our guidepost on this, unless somebody empirically that analysis is flawed somehow. That should be our analysis, and we should, as a body, point toward that, absent any other empirical evidence that we shouldn't. So I am in favor of this motion.
Further comments?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Clouston online.
Go ahead, Representative Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Woolmarth, I'm looking up Wyoming's inflation increase last year was 4%. If you can do some quick math for me, if we do a 4% increase to match inflation, 4.1%, what would that amount look like for the state of Wyoming for education?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Clausen, you just want 4% for each of the categories?
Yes.
Let me run it here, give me a few minutes.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Representative Provenza.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess in response to Representative Clausen, I think we're looking at more than just the last year of inflation, right? And the fact that we are also behind by $30 million to begin with, and why we had to go into executive session to talk about litigation. So I would caution the committee to think in terms of the ease of looking at an inflation number when we know that this calculation is far more complicated than that, and we need to ensure that we are paying people what they're worth. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see one of our greatest exports, which is our young people in this state, which I think we saw plenty of data on today.
All right, anybody else?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Representative Berger.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And it was brought up, a few people mentioned their aha moment. I have two aha moments here. One, this is going to be why I do support this motion. But one aha moment for me was what districts are doing locally with the block grant. And one, they're struggling, but two, it's evident that they are seeing the needs per district. It's local spending and how they spend their block grant locally, and they're making the decisions on what to do with that. And number two, my aha is again the decrease in students seeking education degrees, especially at the University of Wyoming, but nationwide. I've looked at the numbers for quite some time. And it brings me to this question to all of you sitting on this committee and the Joint Appropriations Committee. Why didn't you become a teacher? Why? I know why I became a teacher, but why didn't you become a teacher? And think about that. Why aren't these kids, or why aren't these people choosing to become a teacher? And I'm not asking you to answer out loud. I'm asking you to think about it in your head. And then the last question I have for all of you to think about: why would you even want to become a teacher right now? Why? I don't understand. But I am supporting this motion. I wish it was higher. I wish it was more, up to 10%, but 8 is get it back to our constitutional obligation, and I truly feel that. And something to think about. Hopefully you self-reflect on those questions. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Matt.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Clausen, if the model were to be adjusted just by 4% for each of the four categories for 2025-26, the estimated cost is $41 million in total. So about 3.1 million more than the recommended ECAs.
That's right. So only the Education Committee votes on this. Any other comments? Concerns? All right, I believe it's a roll call.
Mr. Chairman, you don't have to do a roll call, but if that's your preference, we can do that.
Well, with online, it's going to be tough to make sure we hear everybody. So that'll be the easiest way.
Mr. Chairman, can I ask a quick question first?
Certainly.
So what is the total again on the current motion from Senator? Dollar amount?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Klauston, the estimated total is approximately 66.3 million.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address Representative Berger's question about picking education as opposed to other occupations, because I did start out in the teaching profession and then switch to the accounting profession. And one of the main components of that decision was I calculated that I could make a lot more money in the accounting profession than the future looked in education for me. So I think that is calculated in a lot of people's minds. So if people going into education feel like they're going to be whipsawed on this issue or nickel and dimed on this issue, they're going to go someplace where they can control that factor a little bit better. And so, personal experience. Thanks.
All right, question's been called. We're going to vote on a motion for 8.5% raise on professional staff, 8.5% raise on non-professional staff. Educational materials would be 1.068, and energy is a negative 6.285. By roll call, please.
Mr. Chairman, on that ECA adjustment, Senator Beitman. Who's online? Okay, he is no longer online. Would you like to excuse him from this vote?
Would you like to excuse Beitman?
Yeah, excuse me.
Senator Brennan?
Aye.
Senator Rothfuss?
Aye.
Senator Steinmetz is excused. Representative Allred?
Aye.
Representative Andrew?
Aye.
Representative Berger?
Aye.
Representative Brown?
Aye.
Representative Klauston?
Aye.
Representative Lawley? Representative Obermueller?
Aye.
Representative Provenza?
Aye.
Co-Chairman Scott?
No.
Co-Chairman Northrup?
Aye.
You have 10 aye, 11 aye, sorry, I'm struggling with math this morning. 11 aye, 1 no, 2 excused.
All right. That motion's passed. Will you meet again in what date? I could look on my calendar.
Mr. Chairman, you're meeting November 13th and 14th in Cheyenne.
All right.
And Mr. Chairman, we may be able to whittle it down to a single day, just depending on how much you want to add to the agenda.
I could shovel in another day. No.
So
All right.
it'll be your prerogative whether you want to meet the 13th or the 14th. We can look at potential committees meeting before or after that to see if it benefits another day or not.
All right. Everybody turned in their reimbursement for request form? With that, we will be adjourned.